Welcome to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Learn more about the pulp magazines through articles, blogs, bibliographies, links, over 100 episodes of this podcast, and much more at thepulp.net. In this Pulp Event podcast, Nicholas Parisi discusses the sports stories of Rod Serling. Nicholas is the author of Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination, and is president of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. The presentation was part of a celebration of a centennial of the sports pulps. This podcast was recorded on August 4th at PulpFest 2023 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
When Mike asked me to do this, the sports stories of Rod Serling, I thought it was an interesting idea because I don't think sports stories are the first thing you think of when you think of Rod Serling. But he did write a good number of sports stories. In case you're wondering, I just got silly with this. This is a baseball card I put together. That's Rod swinging a wiffle bat, I think. And this is a list of his major awards on the right side there. For the baseball card aficionados, it's a 1974 Topps design. And the Binghamton triplets. Rod Serling was born in Syracuse, New York, Christmas Day, 1924. And he very shortly after the family moved to Binghamton, which is just south of Syracuse. And that's the Binghamton triplets was a minor league team that was that played in Binghamton at the time. So I played around with that, So I guess it's probably a good idea just to talk a little bit about Rod Serling first, put him in context, and to talk about what kind of stories he was writing. Again, he was born in 1924, so he grew up in the 1930s. In the middle of through the Great Depression in upstate New York. He went to war the day after high school graduation. He enlisted in the army and he went to fight in the Philippines. And he saw some major combat in the Pacific Theater, and he came back, a different person, as you can imagine. So, but at that time, we're talking about the 40s, the 50s. What were the two most popular sports in America? Without a doubt, it's boxing and baseball. That was it. Football was barely on the scene as far as popularity went. Basketball, forget it, was way behind. I mean, wrestling was probably a third behind those two. So, like any red-blooded American kid, he played baseball. And during his military service, he boxed. He was a boxer for his unit. He served with the 11th Airborne, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And during, basic training, he boxed. And he won. He was, at the time, he was what they call the catchweight, which I think is also known as a flyweight. When he joined the military, he was 5 feet, 5 inches tall, 118 pounds. And he was a little guy. And but he was known for having a berserker style of boxing. He was he was a ball of energy his whole life, and he burned out way too soon, unfortunately. But he won his first 17 fights. He won 17 fights in a row, and then in his 18th fight, they put him up against somebody who was much bigger than him and demolished him. And it broke his nose, and he said, "I think I've had enough of this boxing stuff," and that was pretty much it. So he was done with it. But so when he came back from the military. He enrolled at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and that's where he went to school. And he started writing. He started writing while he was in the military, but he really started writing when he was in college. And when he was in college, what did he write about? He wrote about the war and boxing. Those are the two main things that he wrote about when he came back. And the first published fiction that he ever published was in the Antiochian, which was the Antioch College Literary Magazine, and it was a boxing story called The Good Right Hand. So right from the beginning, he was writing sports stories. The Good Right Hand, and Serling would reference this story often over the course of his career because he considered this to be the genesis of Requiem for a Heavyweight. If you read it, it doesn't really have all that much in common with Requiem for a Heavyweight, other than being a boxing story. But it's about a boxer who injures his right hand and can't box anymore. And it's told from the point of view of his manager, who is remembering him. And he killed himself. The boxer killed himself because he felt he had lost his purpose in life. He couldn't box anymore, and that was it. And this concept, that concept of the athlete, or really could be almost any profession, but athletes particularly, the athlete who can no longer be an athlete and has lost their purpose in life, who's past their prime. It's what I call in the book Rod Serling's obsolete men. They were people that they were a type of character Rod Serling revisited over and over and over again. The people who are trying to make sense of their life, their purpose in life. And Rod Serling had a real affinity for boxers particularly because he felt that boxers, they dedicate their entire life to this one pursuit. Everything is about the next fight. Everything's about getting ready for that fight. And then when you can't do it anymore, really through no fault of your own, through age, the sport discards you. It's done with you. And what are you supposed to do then? So that idea of trying to figure out when you have all this life ahead of you and trying to figure out what am I going to do now was something that Rod Serling was fascinated by. So it came up in boxing, it came up in baseball, it came up in the business world, and that's one of the main themes in Rod Serling's career. So from boxing, this is one of his earliest baseball stories. It's called O'Toole from Moscow. It was on something called Matinee Theater, and as you can see, it says 3 p.m., so it was a matinee. It was an afternoon show. Leo DeRocher, manager of the Cardinals, was in it. This is it's a comedy, and Rod Serling, again, is something else he's not known for is his comedies, and probably for good reason, but this is actually a pretty funny one. This, unfortunately, there's no film of this. It doesn't exist, but I've read the script, and the script is pretty funny. It's about a Russian embassy worker in New York who has been going AWOL. They keep losing this guy. Where is he going? And they find out he's been going to Ebbets Field every day. He's been going to the baseball games. And he's fallen in love with baseball. He's a Russian, and he's, the American pastime. He's fallen in love with it. So he ends up having to kind of go on the lam from New York, and he just takes a train as far as he can go. And where does he end up? He ends up in Cincinnati. And Rod Serling worked in Cincinnati. He went to school in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And then he worked in Cincinnati radio and Cincinnati television. So there was this connection Rod Serling had with Cincinnati and the Cincinnati Reds. And so where would a Russian go to play? He'd play for the Reds. So that was the brilliant concept behind that. And I think it's pretty certain that where this came from. Of course, this was 1954, I believe this aired. It might have been a little earlier, 53, 54. And during that time, we're talking about the Red Scare, we're talking about the Red Scare, and during that time, you may not know, but I happen to be a Cincinnati Reds fan, actually, and during that time, the Cincinnati Reds actually officially changed their name from Reds to Redlegs, because the term Reds had such an evil connotation at the time that they actually changed the name to Redlegs, so I'm sure that's what inspired this story about a Russian going to play for the Reds. And yeah, it is a pretty funny story. Just not too long ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, a radio station in Cincinnati reproduced this, actually. And Ann Serling, Rod's daughter, played the narrator, and they did a really, really good job with it. A Cincinnati sports writer, a friend of mine, actually adapted it for the new radio production. So that was one of his early baseball stories. Right, and not too long after this, another baseball story he did was called Old MacDonald Had a Curve. It was another comedy. And this was on, I'm not even sure what that was on, might have been Kraft Theater, I'm not positive. But that one exists, that show exists, and actually Rod included the script for it in one of his script collection books in Patterns. Old MacDonald Had a Curve is in there. And that's another one that's somewhat along the lines of Rod's obsolete men kind of stories. It's about a 67-year-old pitcher, former pitcher, obviously, 67-year-old, who he suffers an injury to his elbow, and he suddenly is able to throw these ridiculous curveballs because it's just this weird angle that his elbow is at. So he ends up going back to pitch when he's 67 years old. And it's a funny story that if you watch it now, and it's not available really anywhere, but if you watch it, it's the limitations of early television really kill it, because they just couldn't reproduce a baseball, so a stadium or a baseball field. It just looks ridiculous. But that's so that was the next one before we get, of course, the Twilight Zone, and then the Twilight Zone. This was the probably the most famous sports story in the Twilight Zone, the Mighty Casey. It's Robert Serling, who actually did a bid for murder after this. Believe it or not, I think he spent the rest of his life in prison after this. Not immediately after this, but sometime after. This was about a scientist who creates a robot pitcher, and he plays for the fictional Hoboken Zephyrs, and who were in last place. And of course, when Casey comes along, he's a robot pitcher, and he wins every game, and they start winning. And the commissioner of baseball says, no, you can't have a robot pitcher because the rules of baseball specifically say you have to have 9 men on the field, and he's not a man, so you have to get rid of him. So the option, the scientist who created them, the option he had was, well, either to take him off the team or give him a heart. The commissioner said if he has a heartbeat, he's a man. So they gave him a heart, and what happens? He with the heart, he becomes sentimental. He develops sentimentality, and now he can't bear to strike anybody out. I can't bear to make him feel bad, and that was the end of his pitching career. So I think it's a pretty good episode. I mean, Rod's comedies, again, they get a bit short shrift, but I think it's actually a pretty good episode. Jack Warden played the coach in this episode, and Jack Warden actually played the same role in Old MacDonald Had a Curve. Old MacDonald Had a Curve, a lot of it is recycled into this episode. A lot of the dialogue is verbatim from that earlier script, and there's a couple of character names are exactly the same, including the Jack Warden character. So Rod was very adept at recycling his stuff. He was almost certainly the most prolific writer in television history. I mean, he wrote about 250 scripts that were produced either on television, radio, or feature films. But one of the reasons he was able to do that was because, he was very good at recycling things, readapting them into different, expanding them from half an hour to an hour, cutting them from an hour to a half an hour, that kind of thing. So he reused a lot of stuff. But if you want a taste of Rod's short prose fiction, he did write this as a short story in one of the Twilight Zone story collections. Rod published 3 Twilight Zone short story collections while the show was airing. So he wrote these himself. These weren't ghostwritten or anything like that. After each season, he wrote a collection of Twilight Zone stories. There's 3 of them, and The Mighty Case is included in one of those. And it was also included in this book, Baseball 3000, futuristic baseball stories. Rod's Twilight Zone short stories, some of them were very good. He was not a short story writer, at least not at that time anyway. He got much, much better as time went along. But the Twilight Zone short stories, some of them are very good, some of them aren't. And he said I sweated blood on those short stories. It was hard. It was the first time he'd written short stories since college, so he was not in his element, But he got through it, and that story is pretty good. So going back before the Twilight Zone, I was trying to take a jump back again. As I mentioned, Requiem for a Heavyweight. Requiem for a Heavyweight was Rod Serling's masterpiece. It was his own personal favorite of his work, and it was the story that really. It meant so much to Serling, professionally and personally. If you know anything, I'll tell you just a little bit about Rod Serling's career trajectory. Rod Serling was a working writer through the 50s. From 1950, he sold his first script to a national television series in 1950. And between 1950 and 1954, he was incredibly prolific. He wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. Rod Serling was a workaholic, and he just constantly wrote, and he was able to sell with the help of a very good agent, Blanche Gaines. He was able to sell a lot of stuff to pretty much every television series that was on the air at the time. Stars Over Hollywood, Kraft Theater, Studio One, Matinee Theater, General Electric Theater, any theater that was on the air at the time, pretty much Rod Serling sold something to it. But he hadn't really written anything that was, really, really outstanding. He wrote some good stuff. Don't get me wrong, but he hadn't written anything that really knocked anybody out until January of 1955 when a show called Patterns came on. And Patterns was a show on the Kraft Theater that Rod Serling wrote that turned the whole television industry on its ear. This was, whenever I talk about Patterns, I always preface this by saying I'm not exaggerating. This isn't hyperbole. It's because it sounds like it. It really does sound like it. But The next day, after Patterns aired, I mean, the New York Times said it was the best thing they'd ever seen on television. From a standpoint of directing, writing, production, it was the best thing that had ever been, the best dramatic presentation in the history of television. Now, the history of television, of course, was about 5 years old, but still, it was phenomenally well reviewed to the point where it was even repeated 3 months later. It was a live performance, and they got the same cast back together again to repeat it, to do it again, due to popular demand. It was the first time any show had that happen, where people, was that hungry to see it again. So where I'm getting at with Requiem for Heavyweight was after Patterns, for about a year or almost 2 years, Rod Serling, who was incredibly hard on himself, he was trying over and over again to better Patterns, to best Patterns. He wanted something that was going to hit the critics even harder than Patterns did, and he kept, as far as he was concerned, kept failing. He wrote a lot of really good stuff after Patterns that he didn't give himself nearly enough credit for, but nothing really knocked the critics out until Requiem for Heavyweight with Jack Palance. And Requiem for Heavyweight was the first 90-minute original television production. First 90-minute original television on Playhouse 90. It was the second episode of Playhouse 90. The first episode, Rod Serling also wrote, called Forbidden Area, but that was based on a novel, a science fiction novel, actually. So that was an adaptation. So this is the first original 90-minute television production. And if anything, this was better reviewed than Patterns was. This pretty much swept the Emmy Awards the next year, but won for Best Director, Best Writer, Best Actor, Jack Palance, and now Rod Serling felt finally that he was vindicated, that he was validated, that Patterns wasn't a fluke, and now I've really arrived. So Requiem, as I said, he was Rod Serling's favorite among his shows, because again, now you're talking about the quintessential Rod Serling obsolete man, Mountain McClintock, who has been a good heavyweight fighter. He's worked his whole life for this. He got as high as number 5 in the heavyweight rankings, and now he's just done. He's too old. He has an eye injury. He can't box anymore. What do I do? And that's what this story is about. It's about him trying to find some purpose in his life after his boxing career is done. So this aired on Playhouse 90, and when it aired on the BBC, they produced it on the BBC about a year later. They were going to get Jack Palance to recreate his role, and he couldn't do it. So they got this young Scottish actor on the left there. Do you recognize him? Okay. I wasn't sure how much he really looks like him, but yeah, Sean Connery, one of his very first roles was playing Mountain McClintock in the BBC production of Requiem for Heavyweight. Unfortunately, no film of this performance exists, but the audio exists, believe it or not. The British Film Institute has the audio of this performance. So, and then, it went on to be a feature film with, as Gary said, Anthony Quinn, and it was released as Blood Money in England. Yeah, England. And this is one of those, if you look on IMDb, I think IMDb still has this wrong. People actually email me every now and then. They say, "What's Blood Money?" It says it's a TV production. It's not. It's the British title of Requiem for Heavyweight. And Rod Serling preferred the television version. I do too. I like the feature film, but I prefer the television version primarily because of Jack Palance. I think Jack Palance is much better at this in this role anyway than Anthony Quinn. Although I do love Jackie Gleason, of course, who doesn't? But yeah, I would definitely prefer the television version. Just checking my notes. Yeah, I'm not checking my texts. I actually have notes here. So even after the feature film version, which was 1962, so that was 7 years after, six or 7 years after the television production. Rod Serling, still wasn't done with it. He always envisioned Requiem as a Broadway play. He wrote it as a play. I mean, and it was a play. The Playhouse 90 version is a play. I mean, all the Playhouse 90s were really, to some extent, plays. But so he always envisioned it as a play. And if Rod Serling had one unrealized dream, it was to be a Broadway playwright. That was his big dream, and he wasn't able to accomplish it during his life, but he was able to get it posthumously. And Requiem for Everybody actually did make it to Broadway. You may have blinked and missed it because it lasted less than a week. But it starred John Lithgow as Mountain McClintock. And it opened and closed in less than a week. It got terrible reviews, but John Lithgow got great reviews. He actually got a Tony nomination out of it, which I think is pretty amazing for a show that opened and closed in less than a week. I mean, I'm not a Broadway expert, but I would think that's pretty unusual to be nominated for something that lasted like 4 performances. Again, he made it. Rod would have been very proud that it finally made its way to Broadway. Let's see. And getting back to, boxing, getting back to the Twilight Zone. Probably his most famous boxing story on the Twilight Zone was this one called The Big Tall Wish, which was about a boxer named Boley Jackson, as you can see there on the right, and this little boy who worships him. And the little boy convinces Boley Jackson that if he wishes, that he has a power, that if he wishes for something, if he makes a big tall wish, that it'll come true, whatever it may be. If I could wish for it, it'll come true. And he wishes for Boley Jackson to win the fight that night. So they filmed the fight that night. Boley Jackson seems to be losing the fight. He gets knocked down and knocked out. And the next thing you know, he's the one standing and raising his arms, and his opponent has been knocked out. And he comes back, and the little boy tells him, "I told you, I did it. I wished for it to happen." And Boley refuses to believe that the kid had anything to do with it. He says, "There is no magic. I won the fight. It was all me. That's impossible." And so what happens? He couldn't believe in the magic, so it goes back, and then you find Boley's on the mat, and his opponent has won. And he learns the lesson that sometimes you have to believe in the magic. You have to believe for it to happen. You have to believe. It's a good story. It's a good episode. The kid is very good. Ivan Dixon was the boxer. Ivan Dixon, I think he was later in Hogan's Heroes, right? A show that Rod Serling loathed, by the way.
And he eventually went on to direct.
Yeah. And a little trivia note, Ivan Dixon's son was in a show that Rod Serling wrote called A Storm in Summer in 1970. One of the only things his son ever did, and he's terrific in it, and it's one of Rod Serling's best shows. So Twilight Zone had a few more sports stories, but Rod didn't write them. There's another boxing story that's maybe even more famous than this one called Steel, which was written by Richard Matheson, about robot boxers, starring Lee Marvin. And it ended up being the inspiration for a Hugh Jackman movie called Real Steel. One of my favorite episodes of Game of Pool was written by George Clayton Johnson, Jack Klugman and Jonathan Winters, about a guy who plays pool against a ghost and wins, but he wins a little more than he bargained for. And that's a great episode. Rod didn't write those. There are a couple of other baseball references in the Twilight Zone. That again, baseball. I love watching. There's an episode of Playhouse Night, actually Forbidden Area I mentioned earlier. Forbidden Area begins with a guy. It's about a spy, Russian spies infiltrating the U.S. military. And in the beginning, they're trying to train this guy to be a real American. So what do? They give him baseball quizzes. So he has to ask these questions about baseball, about the Cincinnati Reds. The Cincinnati connection there. And he's answering these questions about the Reds. It's a really cool scene, actually. And in the Twilight Zone, you have things like that. There's an episode called On Thursday We Leave for Home, one of the hour-long episodes where there's a line that says they're playing baseball actually before they go back to Earth. They're on an asteroid. They're on another planet. They're coming back to Earth, and one of the astronauts says that's the universal language, baseball. And probably my favorite Twilight Zone episode, Walking Distance, about a guy who goes back in time to his childhood, and to revisit his childhood. There's a scene where when he first goes back to his childhood home, what does he see? The first thing he sees on the ground, he kicks his old baseball glove. And he picks it up and he says, I remember when my dad bought me this with the baseball signed by Lou Gehrig. That was the tie to his childhood, was baseball. So I like seeing that stuff. Just it reminds me of how ingrained baseball was in the culture in the country. It really was, the national pastime. So that was basically the sports stories. And again, Rod Serling did publish them. The Mighty Casey was published in short story form. Of course, Steel, the Richard Matheson story, that's in his collections. Game of Pool is in the George Clayton Johnson collection. So they are available in prose form if you're interested. Any questions?
Would you consider Kick the Can a sport?
I was thinking of that. I was trying to go there and say, Kick the Can. Sure. Yeah, that's a George Clayton Johnson story. Yeah, Kick the Can. That was remade in the Twilight Zone movie. And I don't think I would consider that a sport, though. Although in the movie version, they do mention boxing. Though, do you remember the movie version? And it says Joe Lewis was married to Joe Lewis, not the boxer. The old ladies. Close though. Close. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for hanging out.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast brought to you by the Pulp Net, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Learn more about the pulp magazines through articles, blogs, bibliographies, links, over 100 episodes of this podcast, and much more at thepulp.net. Also, look for the Pulp Net on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. This Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2023 by William P. Lampkin. All rights reserved.